Do you believe a single angel can be more powerful than the most feared army in history? In a single night, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, veterans of dozens of victorious battles, equipped with the most advanced war tech of their time, were completely wiped out by a supernatural force that defies all military and scientific logic. This isn't fiction, it's not a legend, but a real event recorded in the sacred pages of the Bible, a miracle so extraordinary, it forever changed the course of Middle Eastern history. What you're about to discover will shake your beliefs about what's truly possible when we put our trust in divine power. Get ready for a journey that will transform your perspective on prayer, faith, and God's supernatural intervention in human history. This is the account that reveals how a king named Hezekiah faced the greatest military threat of his time, armed only with prayer and unwavering faith, and how God responded in a way that would leave any modern general speechless. You'll witness the ultimate showdown between human arrogance and celestial power, between trust in earthly armies and total reliance on the creator of the universe. We're not just talking about a military victory, but a demonstration of divine power that continues through the centuries as a living promise for all who face impossible situations. This story will revolutionize your understanding of what God can do when his people cry out to him with genuine faith. The year was 701 BC, and the known world trembled at the name of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, whose empire stretched like a terrifying shadow over all nations. His armies were relentless war machines, known for their boundless cruelty and for never having known defeat on the battlefield. City after city fell before their relentless march, and the screams of terror from entire peoples echoed through the mountains and valleys of the Middle East. It was a time when military power determined the fate of nations, and Assyria possessed the most fearsome of all armies. But in Jerusalem, there was one man who would not bow down to this seemingly invincible force. King Hezekiah of Judah represented something completely different from what the world was used to seeing in its leaders. While other kings relied on political alliances, mercenary armies, and sophisticated military strategies, Hezekiah had chosen a path that seemed like madness in human eyes: to trust entirely in the invisible God of Israel. He had witnessed deep spiritual reforms in his kingdom, destroying idols and restoring the worship of the true God. His faith wasn't just a superficial religious belief, but a conviction that permeated every political and military decision he made. When news arrived that Sennacherib had conquered 46 fortified cities of Judah and was now marching toward Jerusalem, Hezekiah didn't panic like any rational leader would. The contrast couldn't be more dramatic. On one side, we had human pride at its peak, represented by Sennacherib, who considered himself invincible and mocked any power that wasn't his own iron fist. His generals publicly boasted about how they had destroyed other gods and their nations, proclaiming that the God of Israel would just be another powerless deity on their list of conquests. On the other side was Hezekiah's genuine humility, who recognized his total dependence on divine power and wasn't ashamed to admit that without God, Jerusalem would just be another doomed city. It was the ultimate clash between human arrogance and true faith, between temporal power and eternal power. The scriptures reveal in 2 Kings 18:13 that in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. The situation was desperate by any military standard. The Assyrian army had demonstrated its overwhelming superiority, and now Jerusalem was completely surrounded, isolated, and seemingly doomed. Sennacherib's soldiers were not only numerous, but they were veterans of dozens of victorious campaigns, equipped with the most advanced war tech of their time. They knew every siege tactic, every weak point in the fortifications, and had the absolute confidence of those who had never lost a battle. To any external observer, the outcome was already decided before it even began. But there was something Sennacherib didn't understand, something that completely eluded his military and political mindset. He wasn't just facing a small earthly kingdom, but was directly challenging the creator of the universe. His arrogance had blinded him to a fundamental spiritual reality, that there is a power above all human powers, an authority that cannot be conquered by brute force or military strategy. Hezekiah knew this, and that certainty would become the key to the miracle that was about to happen. Can you imagine the tension of those days when two completely opposing worldviews were about to definitively collide? But what happened when one man's unwavering faith came face to face with the most terrifying threat his nation had ever encountered? When Sennacherib's messengers arrived at the gates of Jerusalem, they didn't just come with military threats, but with a devastating psychological weapon, calculated blasphemy and public humiliation. The Rabshakeh, spokesman for the Assyrian king, shouted his words in Hebrew so all the people could understand, mocking the God of Israel and comparing him to the powerless gods of the nations already conquered. His words echoed through the walls like poison. Don't let Hezekiah deceive you by making you trust in the Lord, saying, "The Lord will surely deliver us." 2 Kings 18:30. It was a cruel and effective strategy, destroying the people's morale even before physically attacking, planting seeds of doubt about their God's power. The silence that followed was deafening, for the people had been instructed by Hezekiah not to answer a single word. But it was exactly in that moment of greatest pressure that Hezekiah's true nature shone brightest. Instead of calling an emergency meeting with his generals, instead of sending ambassadors to negotiate terms of surrender, or instead of seeking desperate alliances with other nations, Hezekiah did something that would baffle any military strategist. He tore his clothes, covered himself in sackcloth, and went directly to the Lord's temple. It wasn't a theatrical display or an empty ritual, but the genuine expression of a heart that knew exactly where to find the true source of power. His tears weren't from despair, but from total surrender, recognizing that only God could reverse a humanly impossible situation. It was the prayer of a man who had learned that true strength doesn't come from muscles or weapons, but from an intimate connection with the Almighty. What Hezekiah did next would become one of the most powerful examples of effective prayer recorded in the Bible. He took the blasphemous letter sent by Sennacherib and literally spread it out before the Lord in the temple. Imagine the scene: the king of Judah, alone in the divine presence, holding in his hands the arrogant words that challenged the Creator himself and presenting them as evidence of the urgent need for celestial intervention. His prayer, recorded in 2 Kings 19:15-19, wasn't a desperate plea, but a declaration of mature faith. O Lord God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. He began by recognizing God's absolute sovereignty, laying the correct theological foundation before presenting his request. It was the prayer of someone who deeply knew the divine character. Hezekiah's spiritual depth manifested in how he structured his intercession. First, he exalted God's greatness. Second, he acknowledged the reality of the threat. Truly, Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste the nations and their lands. Third, he identified the core of the spiritual issue, because they have cast their gods into the fire. And finally, he presented his specific request. Now, therefore, O Lord our God, save us from their hand. There was no emotional manipulation or spiritual bargaining, but a clear and honest presentation of the situation before the one who already knew all the details. Hezekiah knew that he wasn't informing God about something he didn't know, but was aligning his heart with divine will and demonstrating his total dependence. It was the prayer of a man who had learned that God doesn't need our information, but desires our trust. What makes this prayer even more extraordinary is the reason Hezekiah presented for God to act, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. 2 Kings 19:19. He wasn't asking for deliverance just to save his own skin or preserve his kingdom, but so that God's name would be glorified before all nations. His motivation was completely theocentric. He wanted the entire world to witness the incomparable power of the God of Israel. It was a prayer that transcended personal or national interests, focusing on divine glory as the supreme goal. Hezekiah had understood a profound truth. When our prayers are aligned with God's eternal purposes, they become powerful instruments in the hands of the Almighty. Have you ever stopped to think about how your own prayers reflect your deepest motivations? But did God really hear that desperate prayer? And how would he respond to such a direct challenge to his sovereignty? God's answer to Hezekiah's prayer came so fast and direct, it would leave any skeptic speechless. Even before the king finished praying, the prophet Isaiah was already on his way to the palace with a divine message. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I have heard your prayer concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria. 2 Kings 19:20. These words must have sounded like heavenly music to Hezekiah's ears, confirming that his pleas not only reached the divine throne, but were immediately answered. There was no heavenly bureaucratic delay, no need for human intermediaries, and no questioning the legitimacy of the request. The God of the universe had heard his servant's prayer and was ready to act in a way that would demonstrate his absolute power before all the earth. It was the beginning of a supernatural intervention that would redefine the concept of impossible. The prophecy Isaiah brought wasn't a vague or conditional promise, but a specific and detailed declaration of what God would do to Sennacherib. Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return. 2 Kings 19:32-33. Every word was a sealed divine sentence, a decree that not all the armies on earth could reverse. God not only promised to protect Jerusalem, but specified exactly how it would happen. The mighty Sennacherib, who had humiliated entire nations, would be forced to return the same way he came, without even firing a single arrow at the holy city. It was a military and political humiliation of epic proportions, orchestrated by the Creator himself. The precision of the prophecy revealed that God not only knows the future, but controls it completely. Then came the night that would forever change the course of Middle Eastern history. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. 2 Kings 19:35. Imagine the scene. While the Assyrian soldiers slept in their tents, confident in their numerical and military superiority, a single angel sent by God silently moved through the entire camp, executing divine judgment with surgical precision. There was no epic battle, no dramatic military confrontation, no complex strategies, just the pure and simple manifestation of supernatural power. Within hours, the most feared army of the ancient world was completely annihilated by a force that transcends all human understanding. It was the definitive demonstration that there is a power above all earthly powers. What makes this miracle even more impressive is how it happened, without bloodshed from Jerusalem's defenders, without the sacrifice of innocent lives, without the destruction of the city or its structures. The angel of the Lord acted with a precision that only divine power can achieve, perfectly distinguishing between those who should be judged and those who should be protected. When the sun rose the next morning, what the inhabitants of Jerusalem saw from the walls was not an army ready to attack, but a field covered with inert bodies, 185,000 warriors who the night before were the embodiment of terror, now lay silent as a testament to God's incomparable power. It was a scene that would forever engrave in humanity's collective memory that there is no force on earth capable of resisting the will of the Almighty. The magnitude of this miracle goes far beyond the impressive numbers. It represents God's direct intervention in human history in a way that leaves no room for natural explanations or coincidences. It wasn't a plague that spread gradually. It wasn't a brilliant military strategy. It wasn't a convenient natural disaster. It was pure and simple supernatural action executed by a celestial agent in obedience to divine command. The verse tells us that when people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies, 2 Kings 19:35, indicating that death was instantaneous and simultaneous for all 185,000 soldiers. It was a demonstration that God doesn't need time, doesn't need human resources, and doesn't need favorable circumstances to fulfill His will. Can you grasp the magnitude of what it means to have this same God as your protector and defender? But how did this supernatural display of power affect Sennacherib himself? And what was the final fate of the one who dared to challenge the Most High? The dawn that revealed the devastation of the Assyrian army also marked the beginning of the most humiliating downfall a king ever experienced in ancient history. Sennacherib, who had woken up expecting to receive reports of victory and plans for the plunder of Jerusalem, was confronted with a reality that completely shattered his worldview. His invincible army had been annihilated by a force he couldn't even comprehend. The same generals who the night before boasted of their conquests were now running in a panic, trying to process the impossible that had happened before their eyes. There was no military explanation, no historical precedent, no war manual that could guide them on how to deal with a supernatural defeat. The man who considered himself the terror of nations now experienced a much greater terror. The terror of someone who discovered that there is a power infinitely superior to his own. Sennacherib's humiliation was even deeper because it fulfilled exactly every detail of the prophecy Isaiah had declared in the Lord's name. God had said through the prophet, "Behold, I will put a spirit in him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." 2 Kings 19:7. Every word of this prophecy would be fulfilled with surgical precision. First, the spirit of terror that seized him before the supernatural destruction of his army. Second, the rumor that forced him to hastily abandon his conquest plans. And third, his violent death in his own land, exactly as God had predicted. It was a demonstration that when God speaks, His words are not just predictions, but decrees that will inevitably be fulfilled. The prophecy was not just a prediction of the future, but the revelation of the divine plan already established from eternity. The verse in 2 Kings 19:36 records almost laconically the shameful retreat of the once powerful king. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and lived at Nineveh. These simple words hide one of the most devastating defeats in military history. A man who had conquered 46 fortified cities of Judah, who had humiliated kings and destroyed nations, now fled like a coward, abandoning equipment, leaving behind the bodies of his army, and carrying only the shame of a defeat he could never explain to his subjects. His reputation for invincibility had been shattered in a single night, and he knew he would never be seen the same way again. The man who had mocked the God of Israel now carried in his conscience the terrifying certainty that he had challenged a force infinitely superior to his own. But divine justice was not yet finished with Sennacherib. 20 years after his humiliation in Jerusalem, while he was worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch in Nineveh, his own sons Adramelech and Sharezer assassinated him with the sword, exactly as God had prophesied through Isaiah. The irony was devastating. The man who had mocked the gods of other nations was killed in his own God's temple by his own children, demonstrating that not even his pagan deities could protect him from the fulfillment of divine judgment. It was the perfect conclusion to a lesson about the inevitable consequences of pride and blasphemy against the Most High. The verse in 2 Kings 19:37 coldly records, "And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his place," a line that definitively ends the story of a man who learned too late that you cannot challenge God with impunity. Sennacherib's downfall became an eternal testimony to a fundamental truth. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16:18. His story is not just a historical account, but a prophetic warning for all generations about the inevitable fate of those who exalt themselves against God. He had made the fatal mistake of confusing temporal power with eternal authority, of believing that his military conquests placed him above the spiritual laws that govern the universe. His defeat was not just military or political, but existential. The revelation that all human greatness is like vapor before divine majesty. Have you ever stopped to reflect on how pride can blind even the most powerful to the spiritual realities that truly govern this world? But what is the lasting legacy of this extraordinary divine intervention, and how does it continue to impact our faith today? The miracle of the Assyrian army's destruction wasn't just an isolated event in Israel's history, but was carefully preserved in the scriptures as an eternal testament to God's power and faithfulness for all future generations. The very fact that this story has reached us, recorded in multiple books of the Bible, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah, reveals the importance God attached to this event as a source of encouragement and faith strengthening. Every detail was preserved with divine precision: the exact numbers, the specific words of the prophecies, the names of the characters involved, and even the most intimate aspects of Hezekiah's prayer. It was as if God was telling future generations, "Remember this day, for what I did once, I can do again." The biblical record isn't just history, but living prophecy for our days. The divine strategy of preserving this memory goes far beyond simple historical documentation. It establishes a pattern of how God acts on behalf of those who trust Him completely. Every time a believer faces an impossible situation, every time circumstances seem overwhelming, every time enemies seem invincible, this story resonates like a trumpet of hope, reminding us that the same God who sent His angel to destroy 185,000 soldiers in one night remains in control of all situations. The psalmist David captured this truth when he wrote, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." Psalm 27. The story of Hezekiah and Sennacherib is the perfect illustration of this fundamental spiritual truth. It was a lesson that would transcend cultures, eras, and specific circumstances. The impact of this story on the formation of God's people's spiritual identity is incalculable. It taught subsequent generations that prayer is not just a religious ritual, but a powerful spiritual weapon capable of moving the hand of the Almighty. Hezekiah became a model of how a leader should react in times of crisis, not with panic or purely human strategies, but with unwavering faith and total dependence on God. His prayer in the temple, spreading the blasphemous letter before the Lord, became a paradigm of effective intercession that has inspired saints throughout the centuries. Missionaries in hostile fields, pastors facing persecution, families going through devastating crises, all have found strength and direction in this powerful narrative. It was a legacy that would continue to strengthen faith far beyond Israel's borders. The theological depth of this story also established fundamental truths about God's character that continue to be pillars of Christian faith. First, that God hears and answers His children's prayers. Second, that nothing is impossible for Him. Third, that He defends those who honor Him. Fourth, that His word always comes true. And fifth, that He acts not only to deliver His people, but to glorify His name before all nations. Jesus Christ Himself referred to the power of prayer when He said, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." Matthew 17:20. Hezekiah's story is the practical demonstration of this promise, showing that when our faith is aligned with God's will, literal mountains of obstacles can be removed. It was a truth that would echo through the Gospels and the apostolic epistles. But perhaps the most relevant aspect of this story for our days is its message about the importance of keeping the memory of God's acts alive in our hearts and communities. Hezekiah not only experienced the miracle, but made sure it was recorded and passed down to future generations, because he knew that the faith of coming generations would depend on these sacred memories. In a time like ours, when skepticism and materialism try to explain everything through natural causes, this story remains a beacon of hope, reminding us that we live in a universe governed by a personal God who intervenes in human history when his people cry out to him with genuine faith. Deuteronomy 6:6-7 commands us, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children." Or, the story of the angel who destroyed 185,000 soldiers is exactly the kind of sacred memory we should impress upon the next generations. Are you preserving and transmitting these powerful memories in your own family and community? The same God who sent his angel to destroy 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night is still alive, active, and powerful in our days. This isn't just an ancient story to be admired from a distance, but a living promise that when we face our own Assyrian armies, be they incurable diseases, devastating financial crises, broken relationships, or any situation that seems humanly impossible, we can cry out to the same God with the same confidence Hezekiah demonstrated. His prayer in the temple, spreading the blasphemous letter before the Lord, remains the perfect model of how we should present our impossibilities to the Almighty. The power that acted that night in Jerusalem hasn't diminished one bit through the centuries. The final lesson echoing through this sacred narrative is an urgent call to spiritual awakening and constant vigilance in a world that mocks faith, that trusts only what it can see and touch, that places its hope in fallible human systems. We desperately need to rediscover the power of genuine prayer and unwavering trust in God. Like Hezekiah, we must learn to bring our blasphemous letters, our devastating medical diagnoses, our desperate financial reports, our seemingly irreparable relationships, directly to the throne of grace, knowing that the same God who humbled Sennacherib can turn our situation around in a matter of hours. This story is not just a memory of the past, but a prophecy of what God will still do for those who trust him completely. The question that keeps echoing in our hearts is simple yet transformative. Are you ready to experience the same supernatural power that acted that night in Jerusalem? The angel of the Lord is still waiting for divine orders to act on your behalf. If this story touched your heart and strengthened your faith as it touched mine, I need you to do something very important right now. Hit that like button on this video so more people can discover the extraordinary power of the God we serve. And in the comments, type "I pray and trust in God" as a declaration of faith and a testimony to our entire community. Your participation isn't just a gesture of support for the channel, but a seed of encouragement that can reach someone who is going through their own Assyrian invasion right now. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of these stories that can transform your perspective on the power of prayer and divine faithfulness. But our journey through life-changing biblical truths is just beginning, and there's a question that might be echoing in your mind after witnessing the divine judgment on the Assyrian army. What really happens to those who reject God and his mercy? If you were impacted by the power of the angel of the Lord executing divine judgment in a single night, you need to watch our next video, What the Bible Really Says About Hell, the Destiny You Cannot Ignore, where we reveal deep biblical truths about the eternal destiny awaiting those who choose to live in rebellion against God. It's a natural continuation of this story, showing that the same God who demonstrated his power in Jerusalem also established eternal consequences for our spiritual choices. Click on the card appearing on your screen now, or find the link in the description, because just as Hezekiah's story changed your understanding of the power of prayer, this next revelation can completely transform your perspective on the urgency of salvation and the reality of divine judgment. Don't put it off. Your eternal soul might depend on the truths you're about to discover. May God continue to bless your journey of faith. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring eternal truths that can change your destiny forever.